There's a hollow in the Appalachian Mountains where the census takers refused to go after 1890. Not because of the terrain, not because of the distance, but because of what they found written in the family Bibles. Children with no father listed, siblings married to siblings, and a single surname that appeared on every gravestone for 5 generations. The locals called it different names over the years, but the one that stuck was the one nobody wanted to say out loud: the Hollow of Screams. And what happened there wasn't just poverty or isolation. It was something far more deliberate, something that turned bloodlines into prisons. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In the summer of 1887, a circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Aldridge rode into a valley in eastern Kentucky that didn't appear on any map. He'd been traveling through the backwoods, bringing scripture to forgotten communities, when he took a wrong turn near a dried creek bed. What he found wasn't a town. It was something that looked like a town from a distance, but up close revealed itself as something else entirely. 43 people living in 9 structures, every single one of them sharing the same last name, every single one of them with the same pale, stretched features, eyes set just a little too far apart, hands with fingers that bent at unusual angles. Aldridge wrote in his journal that night that he'd never seen a community so silent. The children didn't play, they didn't laugh, they stood in doorways and watched him with expressions he described as knowing but empty. When he asked to see the family records, the eldest woman in the hollow brought him a leather-bound Bible. Inside, generations were recorded in faded ink. But something was wrong with the entries. Marriages between brothers and sisters. Mothers giving birth at ages that didn't make sense. And in the column where fathers' names should have been, there were only dashes, dozens of them, as if the men who fathered these children either didn't exist or weren't permitted to be named. The Reverend stayed for 3 days. He tried to preach, but nobody came to listen. He tried to ask questions, but the answers he received were circular and strange. "We keep to our own," one man told him. "We always have. We always will." When Aldridge finally left, he marked the location on his personal map with a single word: forsaken. He never went back. And in his later writings, he mentioned the hollow only once more, saying that some places aren't meant to be saved because they've already chosen what they are. The hollow had a name once, though it's been scrubbed from most official records. Local historians who have studied the area believe it was originally settled in the 1790s by 3 families fleeing religious persecution in Virginia. They were part of a splinter sect that believed in absolute separation from the outside world. They called themselves the elect, and they believed that mixing their blood with outsiders would corrupt their souls. So they went deep into the mountains, found a valley with a spring, and built their settlement. For the first generation, there were enough people to maintain some genetic diversity, but by the 1820s, something shifted. The doctrine changed, or maybe it was always this way, and the founders' writings were only now being interpreted literally. Marriage outside the family became not just discouraged but forbidden. The elders began arranging marriages between first cousins, then siblings, then parents and children. They justified it with scripture they'd rewritten themselves, claiming that purity of blood was the same as purity of soul. Any child born from an outside union was considered tainted. Those children, according to one surviving letter found in a neighboring county's archives, were removed from the census of the living. By 1850, the population had grown to nearly 70 people, but the gene pool had shrunk to essentially 3 original bloodlines, all intertwined beyond recognition. Birth defects became common, stillbirths increased. But instead of seeing this as a warning, the community saw it as a test of faith. Children born with deformities were called marked by God and given special status. They were often the ones chosen to carry on the family line, regardless of their ability to consent or comprehend. The outside world had no idea this was happening. The hollow was too remote, too deliberately hidden, and the few travelers who stumbled upon it and tried to report what they saw were dismissed as either drunk or insane. There's a document in the Kentucky Historical Society, buried in a box labeled Unverified Claims, that contains testimony from a mail carrier who delivered a package to the hollow in 1869. He described seeing a woman, no older than 16, nursing 3 infants simultaneously. When he asked if they were triplets, she looked at him with what he called the eyes of someone who'd forgotten how to be human, then said, "They're all mine, they're all his. We keep it clean here." The name Hollow of Screams didn't come from folklore or superstition. It came from something real, something that happened every spring between 1875 and 1891. According to fragmentary accounts pieced together from neighboring townships, travelers passing within 2 miles of the settlement reported hearing screams that lasted for days. Not the screams of animals being slaughtered or women in childbirth, though those sounds were part of it. These were different, rhythmic, ritual, as if timed to some internal calendar only the Hollow's residents understood. A county sheriff named William Marston investigated in 1883 after repeated complaints from loggers working in the adjacent forest. He brought 2 deputies and rode into the hollow at dawn. What they found was a community in the middle of what Marston described as a ceremony of joining. In the center of the settlement was a circular stone platform, stained dark with what appeared to be old blood. Surrounding it were the entire population, men, women, and children, all standing in concentric circles. At the center stood 3 young girls, none older than 14, dressed in white shifts, and standing behind them were 3 men, their faces covered with burlap hoods. Marston demanded to know what was happening. The eldest man in the community, a figure the others called Father Silas, explained that they were conducting marriages. The girls were being sealed to their chosen husbands in accordance with their holy law. When Marston pointed out that the girls appeared to be children and the men appeared to be their relatives, Father Silas smiled and said something that Marston wrote down word for word in his report. "Blood calls to blood, Sheriff. We don't dilute, we refine." Marston wanted to intervene, but he had no legal grounds. The girls, when questioned separately, insisted they were willing. They recited their consent in identical, rehearsed phrases. The deputies noted that the girls' eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if they'd been drugged or conditioned into compliance. But without proof of coercion or evidence of a crime already committed, Marston could do nothing. He left with a warning that he'd return. He never did. 6 months later, he resigned from his position and moved to Ohio. In a letter to his sister, discovered after his death, he wrote, "There are places in these mountains where our laws don't reach, not because they can't, but because what lives there isn't fully human anymore." A dark black and white image of a young girl's face with haunting, emotionally vacant eyes and unusual facial features set against a blurred rustic background of a decaying cabin, with shadows creating an eerie, unsettling atmosphere, emphasizing the disturbing and otherworldly quality of her expression. The children born in the hollow after 1880 were different from those born before. The early generations, despite the inbreeding, still retained some semblance of normalcy. But as the bloodlines collapsed further into themselves, the physical and mental degradation accelerated. A doctor named Samuel Pritchard, who treated patients in the surrounding counties, kept private notes about individuals he suspected came from the hollow. He never named the place directly, but his descriptions were unmistakable. He wrote about patients with skull malformations, club feet, cleft palates that extended into the nasal cavity, and cognitive impairments so severe that some children never learned to speak beyond grunts and gestures. But what disturbed Pritchard most wasn't the physical deformities. It was the psychological uniformity. He noted that every patient he saw from that area displayed the same flat affect, the same inability to make eye contact, the same robotic repetition of phrases when asked about their families. "We are kept pure," they would say. "We are chosen." One teenager he examined in 1,888 had such severe spinal curvature that she couldn't stand upright, yet she insisted she was blessed and perfect in God's sight. When Pritchard gently suggested she might benefit from medical intervention, she became violent, clawing at his face and screaming that he was trying to break the seal. The community's isolation wasn't just geographical. It was enforced. Any member who attempted to leave was brought back. There are accounts from the 1,890s of local sheriffs finding young people wandering the roads, disoriented and injured, claiming they'd escaped from the hollow. But before any investigation could begin, men from the community would arrive, produce documents showing family relation, and take the individuals back. The authorities had no legal standing to intervene. These were family matters, private matters. And in the late 19th century, the law didn't intrude into the home, no matter what happened behind closed doors. One escaped member, a young woman named Sarah, who made it to a convent in West Virginia in 1,894, told the nuns a story so disturbing they initially didn't believe her. She claimed that in the hollow, there was no concept of individual family units. All the children belonged to everyone. Fathers impregnated daughters, brothers impregnated sisters, and the resulting children were raised communally, never knowing their true parentage. She said the community called it the weaving, and that every member was a thread in a tapestry that was supposed to create something pure. But what it actually created, she told the nuns through tears, was a collection of broken people who didn't know how to be anything else. The hollow's existence became an open secret in the region by the turn of the century. Everyone knew it was there, everyone knew what happened inside it, but nobody did anything. The reasons were complicated. Partly it was the culture of the time, the belief that what happened within a family was sacred and untouchable. Partly it was fear. The few government officials who'd visited the hollow and tried to document what they saw often found their careers destroyed afterward. Records would go missing. Testimonies would be recanted. Witnesses would suddenly refuse to speak. There's evidence suggesting that the community had protectors, people in positions of power who ensured the hollow remained undisturbed. Why they would protect such a place remains unclear, though some researchers believe it was simple corruption, bribes paid in whatever currency the hollow could offer. By 1910, the population had dropped to around 30 individuals. The genetic collapse was complete. Infant mortality was above 70%. Most children who survived past age 5 had severe developmental disabilities, but still, the practices continued. A social worker named Margaret Finch visited in 1912 as part of a rural poverty survey. What she documented was a community in its final stage of decay. She described houses that were barely standing, filled with people who seemed more like shadows than human beings. She wrote about a girl, perhaps 8 years old, who was already visibly pregnant. When Finch asked who the father was, an elderly woman laughed and said, "Does it matter? We're all the same blood anyway." Finch tried to remove several children from the hollow. She contacted state authorities, filed reports, and even brought a photographer to document the conditions. But every legal avenue she pursued was blocked. The children, she was told, were with their legal guardians. The marriages, though disturbing, were not technically illegal given the lack of clear documentation about exact relations. And most damning of all, when a judge finally agreed to review the case, the children testified that they wanted to stay. They'd been so thoroughly conditioned, so completely broken, that they defended the very system that was destroying them. Finch suffered a nervous breakdown shortly after, and spent the rest of her life in and out of sanitariums. In her final journal entry, written weeks before her death in 1934, she wrote, "I met evil in that hollow, not the evil of violence or cruelty, but the evil of acceptance. They'd been taught that their suffering was holy. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, or would you have run knowing you might be dragged back?" The hollow died slowly, then all at once. By 1920, there were fewer than a dozen residents left, all of them physically or mentally incapacitated to varying degrees. The last documented birth in the community occurred in 1918. A stillborn child with such severe deformities that the attending midwife from a neighboring town refused to describe what she'd seen, saying only that it wasn't meant for this world. The final generation consisted of individuals who could barely care for themselves, let alone maintain the infrastructure of even a primitive settlement. The cabins collapsed. The spring that had sustained them became contaminated. And, one by one, the remaining members simply died. The last known survivor was a man locals called Silent Thomas. He was found in 1931 by a group of hunters who'd ventured into the hollow out of curiosity. They discovered him living alone in a half-collapsed structure, surrounded by decades of accumulated refuse. Thomas couldn't speak, whether from a birth defect or from sheer isolation, no one could determine. He communicated through gestures and drawings scratched into the dirt. The hunters reported that the walls of his dwelling were covered in symbols, crude family trees that spiraled inward on themselves, names written and crossed out and rewritten until they became illegible. In the center of the largest wall was a single word carved deep into the wood: pure. Thomas was taken to a county hospital where doctors examined him and found evidence of every genetic disorder associated with extreme inbreeding. His skeleton was malformed, his organs were failing, and his mental capacity was estimated to be that of a young child. But what disturbed the medical staff most was his behavior. He would spend hours arranging objects in specific patterns, always in circles, always in groups of 3. When anyone tried to interrupt these rituals, he would become violent, screaming in a voice that didn't sound entirely human. He died 3 months after his rescue, on a night when the hospital staff reported hearing him repeat a phrase over and over in the darkness: "Keep the blood clean, keep the blood clean, keep the blood clean." After Thomas's death, the state sent investigators to the hollow to document what remained. They found 9 structures in various states of collapse, a cemetery with over 200 graves, most of them unmarked, and dozens of personal items that told the story of a community that had existed outside of time and morality. Among the artifacts were family Bibles with entries dating back to 1791, marriage certificates signed by people who shared the same parents, and photographs from the early 1900s that showed families where every face had the same unsettling features, the same vacant eyes, the same expression of resigned suffering. The investigators burned most of what they found. The official report stated it was for public health reasons, but those who participated later admitted it was because they couldn't bear the thought of that history being preserved. The hollow still exists, though its location is deliberately kept vague in most historical accounts. The structures have long since rotted away, reclaimed by the forest. The cemetery is overgrown, the headstones toppled and covered in moss. But locals say the place still feels wrong. Hunters avoid it. Hikers who stumble upon it report feeling watched, feeling a heaviness in the air that makes them want to leave immediately. Some have reported finding objects, rusted toys, fragments of clothing, pieces of furniture, scattered through the woods as if the earth itself is slowly rejecting what was buried there. The story of the hollow raises questions that don't have comfortable answers. How did this happen in America, in the modern era, within reach of law enforcement and social services? How did an entire community engage in systematic incest and child abuse for over a century without meaningful intervention? The truth is that it happened because people allowed it to happen, because privacy and property rights were valued over the welfare of children, because poverty and isolation created blind spots where horrors could flourish unseen, because the people who knew chose to look away rather than confront something that made them uncomfortable. There are scholars who argue that the hollow wasn't unique, that similar communities existed throughout Appalachia and the rural South, places where bloodlines tangled into knots and families became prisons. Most of these communities left no records, no survivors willing to speak, no evidence beyond whispered stories and vague warnings passed down through generations. The Hollow of Screams is remarkable only because enough documentation survived to prove it existed. How many others disappeared completely, their sins buried with their bones, will never be known. The descendants of those who escaped the hollow, the few who got out before the final collapse, live among us today. Most don't know their history. The family name was changed, the stories suppressed, the shame buried so deep that it became invisible. But geneticists who study populations in that region have identified markers, signatures in the DNA that suggest extreme inbreeding occurred in certain family lines within the last century. These markers are still present, still visible, a permanent record of what happened written in the code of human cells. The past doesn't disappear. It just gets hidden. And in the quiet places, in the forgotten valleys, in the hollows where screams once echoed, it waits to be remembered. This isn't ancient history. The last survivor of the hollow died in 1931, within living memory of people still alive today. The place where it happened can still be found if you know where to look. And the question that haunts everyone who learns this story is the same question that should haunt us all. If this could happen then, in a place people knew about, what's happening now in the places we're not looking?